Commander Marcus Chen stood at the observation deck of the mining station Kepler 442b, watching the three alien ships dock with practiced arrogance. The Zephyrians had arrived exactly on schedule, their sleek vessels gleaming like predatory fish against the backdrop of the gas giant's swirling storms. Behind them came the bulkier Corvin transports, followed by the graceful Altarian cruisers that seemed to dance through space itself. Marcus had been the sole human representative on this joint mining operation for 8 months now. What had started as a promising interspecies collaboration had quickly devolved into something far more sinister. The three alien races had formed an unofficial alliance, united by one common trait, their complete disdain for humanity. The airlock hissed open, and the familiar parade of aliens entered the station's main corridor. First came Zextar, the Zephyrian mining supervisor. His scaled hide rippling with bioluminescent patterns that Marcus had learned indicated smugness. The reptilian alien stood nearly 8 feet tall, his predatory eyes immediately scanning the room before settling on Marcus with obvious contempt. Behind him walked Grothmar, the Corvin security chief, his massive frame making the reinforced deck plates groan with each step. The bear-like alien's cybernetic implants gleamed along his skull, and his 4 arms carried enough weaponry to outfit a small army. His species valued strength above all else, and they had made it abundantly clear that they considered humans to be weaklings. Finally, there was Silthera, the Altarian expedition leader. Her ethereal, almost angelic appearance belied a mind that was both brilliant and utterly ruthless. The Altarians considered themselves the galaxy's intellectual elite, and they treated humans like primitive children who had somehow stumbled into space travel through sheer luck. "Ah, the pet human is still here," Zextar hissed, his translator converting his native clicks and growls into standard galactic. "I was hoping you might have finally realized your inadequacy and returned to your little mud ball of a planet." Marcus remained silent, having learned months ago that any response only encouraged their taunts. He simply nodded professionally and gestured toward the conference room where the weekly progress meeting would take place. "Look at it," Grothmar rumbled, his voice like grinding metal. "So small, so fragile. How did such pathetic creatures ever leave their homeworld? They must have stolen their technology from a real species." Silthera's laugh was like silver bells, beautiful and cold. "Oh, Grothmar, you give them too much credit. The humans stumbled onto faster-than-light travel by accident. Their own records show it. A laboratory explosion that they somehow managed to reverse engineer. Pure chance. Nothing more." The three aliens continued their conversation as if Marcus wasn't there, discussing the latest mining yields, security protocols, and resource allocation. They had been systematically excluding him from important decisions for months, relegating him to menial tasks despite his official status as an equal partner in the operation. "The human sectors are producing 30% less than projected," Zextar reported, his scales shifting to deeper purples and reds. "Perhaps we should restructure the operation, remove the inefficient elements." Marcus knew exactly what that meant. The alien races had been sabotaging the human-operated mining equipment for weeks, ensuring that his sections would appear less productive. They wanted Earth's mining consortium to pull out of the operation, leaving the extremely valuable dark matter deposits to be split 3 ways instead of 4. The Galactic Mining Council would frown upon such obvious discrimination, Marcus said quietly. Speaking for the first time since the meeting began, the 3 aliens turned to stare at him as if surprised that furniture had suddenly started talking. "The human speaks," Silthera observed with mock delight. "How fascinating. Tell me, little creature, do you actually believe the Council cares about your species? You've been in space for what, 200 years? We Altarians have been exploring the cosmos for over 50,000 years. The Council understands the natural order of things." Grothmar leaned forward, his cybernetic eye whirring as it focused on Marcus. "The natural order being that the strong consume the weak. Your people learned this lesson on your homeworld, did they not? War after war until the survivors finally achieved peace through exhaustion. Pathetic." "At least we learned from our mistakes," Marcus replied calmly. "Can the same be said for species that still judge others based on arbitrary measures of superiority?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Zextar's scales shifted to an angry crimson pattern that Marcus recognized as a threat display. "Arbitrary?" the Zephyrian hissed. We measure by results, human. Our mining efficiency is 40% higher than yours. Our technology is centuries more advanced. Our ships could reduce your entire fleet to scrap metal within minutes. These are not arbitrary measures. And yet, Marcus said, standing slowly and meeting each of their gazes in turn, here I am. Still standing. Still participating in this operation despite months of sabotage, harassment, and blatant discrimination. Perhaps there's something to be said for human persistence. Silthara's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something that might have been surprise crossing her perfect features. Persistence is the virtue of those lacking in intelligence. A truly superior species would have recognized their limitations and withdrawn gracefully. Or, Marcus said, moving toward the door, a truly superior species would have found a way to turn apparent weakness into unexpected strength. Good day. As the door hissed shut behind him, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. The aliens had no idea what they had set in motion. For 8 months he had endured their mockery, their sabotage, and their attempts to drive him away. But Marcus Chen hadn't survived the corporate wars on Earth, earned his engineering doctorate from Luna University, and commanded deep space mining operations for 15 years by giving up when things got difficult. He made his way to his private quarters, the smallest and most isolated section of the station that the aliens had grudgingly allocated to the human presence. But what they didn't know was that Marcus had spent the last 8 months doing more than just enduring their abuse. He had been watching, learning, and most importantly, preparing. The Human Mining Consortium had given him broad authority to ensure the success of this operation. They hadn't specified exactly what methods he should use, only that failure was not an option. The dark matter deposits on Kepler 442b were worth more than the gross domestic product of most star systems, and Earth needed this operation to succeed. Marcus opened his personal comm unit and began composing a message to Earth. It was time to implement the contingency plan he had been developing. The 3 alien races thought they understood humans, thought they knew what humanity was capable of. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The hunt was about to begin. 3 days after the disastrous meeting, Marcus received confirmation that his message had reached Earth. The response came not through official channels, but via a heavily encrypted personal transmission that appeared to be nothing more than routine family correspondence. Hidden within what seemed like a letter from his sister was a single word: approved. Marcus deleted the message and leaned back in his chair, staring out at the massive gas giant that dominated the view from his quarters. The 3 alien races had no idea that they had just sealed their own fate. They saw humans as weak, primitive, and easily intimidated. They were about to discover that humanity's greatest strength had never been technology or physical prowess, but adaptability and an almost frightening capacity for strategic thinking when pushed to the breaking point. The first phase of his plan was already in motion. For months while enduring the aliens' mockery and sabotage, Marcus had been quietly documenting everything. Every instance of equipment failure, every accidental contamination of human mining sites, every deliberate exclusion from important meetings. The evidence was overwhelming, but more importantly, it established a clear pattern of harassment that would justify Earth's response. But Marcus wasn't just collecting evidence. He had been studying his opponents with the methodical precision of a xenobiologist. The Zephyrians were proud and hierarchical, obsessed with displays of dominance and terrified of appearing weak in front of other species. The Corvins respected only strength and viewed compassion as a fatal flaw. The Altarians considered themselves intellectually superior to everyone else and couldn't conceive of being outmaneuvered by a primitive species. Each race had weaknesses that they didn't even recognize as vulnerabilities, and Marcus had spent 8 months learning exactly how to exploit every single one. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the mining control center to find Zextar and 2 other Zephyrians examining the human equipment with obvious satisfaction. Several key components had been accidentally damaged during the night shift, equipment that would take weeks to repair or replace. Such unfortunate accidents, Zextar hissed, his scales rippling with barely concealed amusement. Perhaps human technology is simply not robust enough for this type of operation. Perhaps, Marcus agreed mildly, making notes on his datapad. I'll need to file another incident report with the Galactic Mining Council. That makes 43 separate instances of equipment failure in the human sectors, compared to 0 failures in the alien-operated areas. Quite remarkable, statistically speaking. Zextar's amusement faded slightly. Are you implying something human? Not at all, Marcus replied. I'm simply documenting patterns for my superiors. They find statistical anomalies fascinating from a probability standpoint. 43-0 is the kind of ratio that makes actuaries very excited. The Zephyrians' scales shifted to a more neutral blue-green pattern. Marcus had learned that despite their aggressive nature, the Zephyrians were actually quite paranoid about official documentation. Their culture had a complex legal system where accusations of sabotage could result in severe penalties, including exile from their homeworld. Later that day, Marcus implemented the second phase of his plan. He began making subtle changes to the mining operation schedules, adjustments that seemed minor but would have significant consequences over time. The three alien races had been so focused on undermining human productivity that they hadn't bothered to coordinate their own operations efficiently. Marcus started scheduling maintenance periods for different species, equipment to overlap, creating resource conflicts that forced them to compete with each other instead of focusing on him. He rerouted supply deliveries to create artificial shortages that affected all three races equally. Most importantly, he began feeding each species slightly different information about the other's activities, planting seeds of suspicion and distrust. The Zephyrians were territorial and didn't like the Corvins expanding their mining operations into sectors they considered their own. The Corvins viewed the Altarians' advanced extraction techniques as potential threats to their own productivity bonuses. The Altarians resented having to share the most promising deposits with species they considered intellectually inferior. Marcus simply gave each group's existing prejudices a gentle nudge in the right direction. Within a week, the first cracks began to show. Grothmar confronted Silthera about Altarian mining drones that had allegedly strayed into Corvin territory. Silthera responded with her usual condescending superiority, suggesting that perhaps the Corvins needed better navigation equipment. The argument escalated until both species lodged formal complaints with the Mining Council. Zextar, meanwhile, had noticed that his carefully guarded survey data seemed to be making its way to the other species' mining supervisors. He began implementing security protocols that made coordination between the different groups increasingly difficult. The three races that had been united in their contempt for humanity were slowly being driven apart by their own character flaws, carefully manipulated by the primitive human they had dismissed as irrelevant. Marcus watched it all unfold from his position on the sidelines, continuing to play the role of the beleaguered human representative, just trying to do his job despite overwhelming odds. He filed his reports, documented every slight and sabotage attempt, and maintained the appearance of someone who was barely hanging on. But in reality, he was orchestrating a complex psychological campaign that was turning his opponents against each other. The aliens had made the classic mistake of underestimating their enemy, based on preconceived notions about human capabilities. 2 weeks into his campaign, Marcus received an encrypted message from a source he hadn't expected. Dr. Sarah Kim, Earth's foremost expert on xenopsychology and the architect of humanity's first contact protocols. The message was brief but significant. Package delivered. Activation in 72 hours. Marcus smiled as he deleted the message. The aliens thought they understood humans because they had read reports about human history, human technology, and human society, but they had never bothered to study the one thing that made humanity truly dangerous: the human capacity for strategic patience and long-term planning. The three alien races were about to discover that when humans decided to hunt, they didn't just track their prey. They studied it, understood it, and then systematically dismantled everything their target thought they knew about the nature of the hunt itself. Phase 3 was about to begin, and Marcus could hardly wait to see the look on Zextar's face when he realized that the pet human had been playing a game several moves ahead of everyone else from the very beginning. The hunter had become the hunted, and they didn't even know it yet. The package Dr. Kim had referenced arrived exactly 72 hours later, disguised as a routine supply shipment of human food and personal items. To any casual observer, it was simply another cargo container keeping the lone human representative supplied with the necessities of life. The aliens barely glanced at it as it was transferred to Marcus's quarters, but hidden within cases of synthesized coffee and protein bars was something that would change the entire dynamic of the mining operation. The most advanced piece of human technology ever deployed in an interspecies operation. The Neural Interface Strategic Command System, or NISC, represented 15 years of development by Earth's most brilliant minds, designed specifically for situations where a single human operative needed to level the playing field against technologically superior opponents. Marcus waited until the night shift began before carefully unpacking the components. The NISC appeared innocuous enough, a series of small devices that looked like standard communication equipment. But when properly configured, it created a sophisticated intelligence network that could monitor, analyze, and predict the behavior patterns of every individual on the station. The system worked by integrating with the station's existing sensor network, something the aliens had never bothered to secure, because they assumed humans lacked the technical sophistication to exploit it. Within hours of activation, NISC was tracking movement patterns, analyzing communication frequencies, monitoring power consumption, and building detailed psychological profiles of every alien on the station. More importantly, it was learning their routines, their relationships, and most critically, their weaknesses. The first major revelation came within 48 hours. Silthera, the supposedly superior Altarian expedition leader, was secretly communicating with someone on her homeworld using unauthorized channels. The transmissions were heavily encrypted, but NISC's quantum processors eventually cracked the code. What Marcus discovered made him smile for the first time in months. Silthera was in serious trouble with her superiors. The Altarian High Council had expected this mining operation to demonstrate their species' intellectual dominance over the other races. Instead, productivity was down, conflicts were escalating, and the other species were beginning to question Altarian leadership capabilities. Silthera's career was hanging by a thread, and she was growing increasingly desperate to prove her worth. The Corvins presented a different type of vulnerability. Grothmar's cybernetic implants, which he wore as symbols of strength and technological advancement, were actually compensation for severe injuries he had sustained in combat years earlier. The implants were controlled by a central processor that had a critical flaw. It could be disrupted by specific electromagnetic frequencies. Not enough to cause permanent damage, but sufficient to cause temporary disorientation and system failures. But it was the Zephyrians who provided the most interesting surprise. Zexitar's aggressive behavior and constant displays of dominance weren't signs of strength. They were symptoms of fear. NISC's analysis of his biological patterns revealed elevated stress hormones and behavior, consistent with someone desperately trying to maintain a position they weren't qualified to hold. Further investigation revealed that Zexitar had obtained his current position through political connections rather than merit, and he lived in constant terror of being exposed as incompetent. Armed with this intelligence, Marcus began the third phase of his campaign. Instead of the broad psychological manipulation he had been employing, he switched to precision strikes designed to exploit each individual's specific vulnerabilities. For Silthera, he began subtly undermining her authority by asking seemingly innocent questions during meetings that highlighted flaws in her decision-making. Nothing obvious or confrontational, just gentle inquiries that forced her to explain increasingly complex problems she hadn't anticipated. Each time she struggled to provide satisfactory answers, her confidence eroded a little more. "I was wondering," Marcus said during one particularly tense meeting, "if you've considered the long-term environmental impact of the Altarian extraction methods on the gas giant's atmospheric composition. I've been running some calculations, and there might be some unexpected interactions between your quantum mining beams and the helium-3 layers." Silthera's perfect composure flickered for just a moment as she realized she hadn't considered that possibility. "The Altarian Science Council has approved all our methods after extensive testing," she replied, but her voice lacked its usual certainty. "Of course," Marcus agreed readily. "I'm sure they accounted for the unique magnetic field fluctuations we've been experiencing. It's probably nothing to worry about, but now the seed was planted." Silthera would spend the next several days frantically reviewing her extraction protocols, second-guessing decisions she had made with complete confidence just hours earlier. For Grothmar, Marcus employed a more direct approach. He began scheduling routine maintenance checks on critical systems at times when the Corvin security chief would be nearby. using equipment that operated on the specific frequencies that interfered with his cybernetic implants. Nothing dramatic, just enough to cause minor glitches that made Grothmar appear clumsy or confused in front of his subordinates. The proud Corvin, who had built his reputation on physical and technological superiority, found himself stumbling at crucial moments, his enhanced reflexes failing him when he needed them most. His subordinates began to whisper about whether their chief was showing signs of age or system deterioration, but it was Zextar who received the most elegant treatment. Marcus began complimenting him publicly on decisions that were actually minor mistakes, praising his innovative thinking in ways that highlighted exactly how far his choices deviated from standard Zephyrian protocols. To outsiders, it looked like respect. To anyone familiar with Zephyrian culture, it sounded like barely veiled mockery. "Your approach to the northwestern mining sector is quite unique," Marcus observed during a station-wide briefing. "I don't think I've ever seen anyone prioritize short-term yield extraction over long-term deposit sustainability quite so creatively." Zextar's scale shifted through several color patterns as he tried to determine whether he was being praised or insulted. The other Zephyrians in the room exchanged glances that made their opinion clear. Within 2 weeks, the 3 alien leaders were struggling with mounting problems of their own creation, each one questioning their abilities and second-guessing their decisions. The unified front they had presented against the human representative was crumbling, as they became increasingly focused on their individual crises. But Marcus was just getting started. The NISC system had identified something even more valuable than individual weaknesses: the critical dependencies that held their entire operation together. Each species relied on the others for specific resources and services, relationships that could be disrupted with surgical precision. The aliens had spent months hunting what they saw as weak human prey. Now they were about to discover what it felt like to be hunted by a predator, who understood that the most dangerous weapon wasn't strength or speed, but the ability to turn an enemy's own nature against them. The real hunt was about to begin. The beauty of Marcus's strategy was its subtlety. To any outside observer, the deteriorating situation on the mining station appeared to be the natural result of interspecies tensions and operational incompetence. The 3 alien races were so focused on their own individual crises that none of them suspected they were being systematically manipulated by the human they had dismissed as irrelevant. NISC had identified the critical weakness in their entire operation: interdependence. Despite their mutual contempt, each species relied heavily on the others for essential services. The Zephyrians provided the specialized geological surveys that located the most valuable deposits. The Corvins handled security and heavy equipment operation. The Altarians managed the complex quantum extraction processes that made mining the dark matter possible. Marcus began targeting these dependencies with the precision of a surgeon removing vital organs. The first domino fell when the Zephyrian geological survey for the next mining phase mysteriously developed serious flaws. Nisk had analyzed Zextar's survey protocols and identified 12 critical errors in his methodology. Marcus didn't correct these errors. Instead, he wrote a detailed technical analysis explaining exactly what was wrong with the survey, then sent it anonymously to Silthera's personal communication system. The message appeared to come from within the Altarian expedition, suggesting that one of Silthera's own scientists had identified the problems but was afraid to report them through official channels for fear of creating an interspecies incident. Silthera, already stressed about her performance and desperate to prove Altarian superiority, immediately began her own analysis of the Zephyrian data. When she confirmed the errors, she faced a difficult choice: expose Zextar's incompetence and risk a major diplomatic crisis, or proceed with mining operations based on flawed data that could result in catastrophic equipment failures. She chose a third option that played directly into Marcus's hands. Silthera began quietly conducting her own geological surveys, duplicating the Zephyrian work while carefully avoiding any direct confrontation. This required diverting Altarian resources from extraction operations, significantly reducing their productivity. When Zextar noticed Altarian survey teams operating in areas he considered his exclusive territory, his paranoia reached new heights. Already insecure about his position, he interpreted this as a direct challenge to his authority. and began implementing increasingly restrictive security protocols that made cooperation between the species even more difficult. Meanwhile, Marcus was implementing the second phase of his dependency disruption strategy. The Corvin security systems that Grothmar managed were sophisticated, but relied heavily on centralized control. Nissi had mapped the entire network and identified several critical vulnerabilities that could be exploited without leaving any trace of human involvement. Marcus didn't attack the system directly. Instead, he created a series of minor anomalies that made it appear as though the Altarian quantum extraction equipment was interfering with Corvin security sensors. The interference wasn't dangerous, just annoying enough to trigger frequent false alarms and system diagnostics. Grothmar, already struggling with the mysterious glitches in his cybernetic systems, became convinced that the Altarians were deliberately sabotaging his security network to cover their unauthorized survey activities. He responded by installing additional monitoring equipment and implementing new protocols that required Altarian personnel to submit to extensive security checks before accessing any mining areas. Silthara, interpreting these measures as attempts to interfere with legitimate Altarian operations, filed formal complaints with the Galactic Mining Council and began developing her own security protocols that deliberately excluded Corvin oversight. The three species that had been united in their contempt for humanity were now actively working against each other, each convinced that the others were sabotaging their operations. But Marcus wasn't finished. The most elegant part of his strategy was yet to come. Essie had discovered that each species was secretly planning to eliminate the others from the mining operation once they had extracted sufficient value from the partnership. The Zephyrians intended to claim the entire deposit under ancient territorial rights laws. The Corvins were planning to use their control of security systems to force the others out through systematic harassment. The Altarians had developed contingency plans to declare the other species mentally unfit for complex operations and petition the mining council for exclusive control. Each group thought they were the only ones planning betrayal. Marcus decided to accelerate their timeline. He began feeding carefully crafted intelligence to each species that suggested the others were preparing to implement their betrayal plans immediately. Anonymous messages appeared in each group's communication systems, containing just enough accurate information to be believable while subtly encouraging them to act preemptively. The Zephyrians received detailed analyses of Corvin military capabilities and suggested defensive strategies. The Corvins got intelligence reports about Altarian political maneuvering and recommendations for countermeasures. The Altarians received psychological profiles of the other species leadership and advice on how to exploit their weaknesses. Each message appeared to come from sympathetic sources within their own organizations, concerned individuals who had uncovered evidence of the other species' plots and wanted to help their own side prepare. Within 72 hours, all three species were operating under the assumption that they were about to be betrayed and needed to strike first to protect their interests. Security levels increased dramatically. Communication between groups became virtually non-existent. Cooperation on mining operations ground to a halt as each species focused on preparing for conflict. And through it all, Marcus continued to play the role of the beleaguered human representative, documenting every incident, filing reports with appropriate authorities, and maintaining the appearance of someone desperately trying to keep the operation functioning, despite overwhelming alien hostility. The morning that changed everything began like any other. Marcus arrived at the control center to find representatives from all three species already there. But unlike previous meetings, they weren't united in their mockery of humanity. Instead, they sat in separate groups watching each other with barely concealed suspicion. Sextar's scales were locked in aggressive red patterns. Grothmar's cybernetic eye was scanning continuously, and his massive hands rested on his weapons. Silthara maintained her usual composure, but Marcus could see the tension in her posture. "I think we need to discuss the future of this operation," Silthara announced, her voice carefully neutral. "Recent developments have made it clear that some participants may not be operating in good faith." "Agreed," Grothmar rumbled. "Trust has been broken. Security has been compromised. Changes must be made." Sextar's response was a low hiss that his translator rendered as untranslatable profanity. Marcus leaned back in his chair and smiled. The hunt was entering its final phase, and his prey was about to discover that they had walked directly into a trap of their own making. The predators had become the prey, and they were about to turn on each other with all the fury that they had originally intended to direct at him. The confrontation that Marcus had been carefully orchestrating for weeks finally erupted during what was supposed to be a routine operational review. The three alien species, each convinced that the others were plotting against them, had reached the breaking point where suspicion overwhelmed their facade of cooperation. Silthara fired the first shot, metaphorically speaking. She stood gracefully, her ethereal features composed but her eyes cold as Arctic starlight. Before we proceed with today's agenda, I believe we need to address the systematic sabotage that has been undermining this operation. Grothmar's cybernetic eye whirred as it focused on her. Sabotage? You mean your unauthorized incursions into secured areas? Your interference with legitimate security protocols? I mean, Silthara replied with icy precision, the deliberate contamination of geological survey data, the installation of surveillance equipment in Altarian quarters, and the mysterious equipment failures that seem to affect only non-Corvan machinery. Zextar's scales had shifted to a pattern that Marcus had learned indicated barely controlled rage. Failures? You mean the damage caused by your quantum extraction beams disrupting established mining operations? Or perhaps the territorial violations that your people have been conducting under the guise of quality assurance? Marcus remained silent, watching the carefully constructed alliance crumble before his eyes. Each accusation contained just enough truth to be believable, mixed with the paranoid interpretations that he had been subtly encouraging for weeks. This is exactly what I expected from primitive species, Silthara continued, her voice dripping with condescension. Unable to handle complex operations, you resort to crude sabotage and military intimidation. The Galactic Mining Council will be very interested to learn about these violations of operational protocols. Grothmar rose from his chair, his massive frame casting shadows across the conference table. Primitive? Your people couldn't secure a storage closet without our protection, and now you dare to threaten us with council intervention? Perhaps it's time you learned what Corvan military doctrine means in practice. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a blade. Marcus could see that all three groups had security personnel stationed just outside the conference room, each species preparing for the possibility that this meeting might turn violent. But violence wasn't part of Marcus's plan. He had something much more devastating in mind. If I may interrupt, Marcus said quietly, his words cutting through the escalating argument like a calm voice in a storm. I think you're all missing the bigger picture here. The three aliens turned to stare at him with expressions ranging from surprise to irritation. For weeks he had been a silent observer of their interactions, absorbing their abuse without comment. His sudden interjection caught them completely off guard. Missing what exactly? Silthara asked, her tone suggesting that she found his presumption amusing. Marcus activated his datapad and projected a holographic display that filled the center of the conference table. The image showed a detailed analysis of the mining operations productivity over the past 3 months, broken down by species and sector. You're missing the fact that while you've been focused on undermining each other, overall productivity has dropped by 67%, Marcus said calmly. Dark matter extraction is down across all sectors. Equipment efficiency has decreased to the point where the operation is barely profitable, and most importantly, the Galactic Mining Council has noticed. The hologram shifted to show a series of official communications from the council, documents that Marcus had been collecting for weeks. Each message showed increasing concern about the declining performance of the operation and growing questions about the competence of the current leadership. According to council regulations, Marcus continued, any mining operation that fails to meet minimum productivity standards for 3 consecutive months can have its management structure reorganized under emergency protocols. We're currently in month 2 of that evaluation period. Zextar's scales shifted to a sickly yellow-green pattern that Marcus recognized as anxiety. You're threatening us with bureaucratic procedures? Typical human weakness, hiding behind regulations instead of taking direct action. I'm not threatening anyone, Marcus replied, his voice remaining perfectly calm. I'm simply explaining the situation as it currently stands. The council has the authority to remove ineffective leadership and replace it with administrators of their choosing. Given the current performance metrics, that's becoming increasingly likely. He paused, allowing the implications to sink in before continuing. Of course, there is an alternative. The council regulations also allow for leadership changes to be implemented internally. Provided all parties agree, and the new structure demonstrates improved efficiency within 30 days. Silthera's perfect composure cracked slightly. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Marcus smiled, and for the first time in months it was a genuine expression of satisfaction rather than diplomatic politeness. "I'm suggesting that perhaps it's time to reconsider the management structure of this operation. The current approach clearly isn't working." The NISC system had been monitoring council communications for weeks, and Marcus knew exactly what was coming. The council had already begun preliminary investigations into the operation's declining performance. They had identified the interspecies conflicts as the primary cause of the problems and were preparing to implement exactly the kind of emergency reorganization that Marcus had just described, but the aliens didn't know that. To them, it appeared that the weak human was somehow threatening their positions through bureaucratic maneuvering. "You think the council would place a human in charge of this operation?" Grothmar rumbled, his tone suggesting the idea was absurd. "Over 3 technologically superior species?" "Not necessarily," Marcus replied. "But they might place someone in charge who has demonstrated the ability to maintain productivity and cooperation. Someone whose sectors haven't experienced mysterious equipment failures or productivity declines. Someone who has a clean record with the council and a documented history of successful interspecies cooperation." The silence that followed was deafening. Each alien was rapidly calculating the implications of Marcus's words, and they were all reaching the same uncomfortable conclusion. The human mining sectors, despite constant sabotage, had maintained higher productivity than any of the alien operations. Marcus's reports to the council had been models of professionalism and diplomacy, even while documenting extensive evidence of harassment and discrimination. His personnel evaluations were spotless, his safety record was perfect, and his technical innovations had actually improved overall efficiency in the areas where they had been implemented. On paper, the human representative looked like the only competent manager on the entire station. Silthera was the first to fully grasp the magnitude of their situation. "You planned this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All of it. The conflicts, the declining productivity, the council scrutiny. You orchestrated everything." Marcus's smile widened. "I documented everything. There's a difference. Every equipment failure, every instance of sabotage, every violation of operational protocols. I simply reported what I observed and let the natural consequences unfold." The truth was finally sinking in. The 3 species that had spent months hunting what they saw as weak human prey had been systematically outmaneuvered by a predator who understood that the most effective hunt doesn't end with the death of the prey, but with the prey destroying itself. "The question now," Marcus continued, "is what happens next. We can continue with the current approach and wait for the council to implement emergency measures, or we can work together to develop a more collaborative management structure." The hunt was nearly over, and Marcus had achieved something that none of the alien species had thought possible. He had turned the hunters into the hunted without firing a single shot or raising his voice in anger. The predators had been caught in a trap of their own making, and now they had to decide whether to gnaw off their own limbs to escape or accept the new reality that the pet human had created for them. The aftermath of Marcus's revelation was like watching a controlled demolition in slow motion. The 3 alien species, who had been so confident in their superiority just moments before, now found themselves staring into an abyss of their own creation. Zextar was the first to break the stunned silence, his scales cycling through colors that Marcus had never seen before, a pattern that suggested complete psychological disarray. "This is impossible. Humans are barely spacefaring. Your species has been in the galaxy for less than 3 centuries. How could I what?" Marcus asked gently. "Outthink you, outmaneuver you, turn your own prejudices against you." He leaned forward slightly, his expression remaining perfectly calm. "You answered your own questions, Zextar. You assumed that humans were inferior because we're newer to space travel. You never considered that being the youngest species in the galaxy might actually be an advantage." Silthera's ethereal features had gone pale, her usual composure completely shattered. "Explain." Marcus activated another display on his datapad, this one showing a timeline of human development compared to the 3 alien species. Every species in this room achieved interstellar travel through gradual technological evolution over thousands of years. You developed your capabilities slowly, building on established traditions and approaches that worked for your ancestors. The display shifted to show human technological development, a steep curve that contrasted sharply with the gradual slopes of the alien timelines. Humans achieved interstellar capability in less than 300 years, starting from a civilization that was still using chemical rockets. We didn't have the luxury of gradual development. We had to adapt, innovate, and overcome obstacles that would have stopped other species entirely. Grothmar's cybernetic implants were functioning normally for the first time in weeks, now that Marcus had stopped broadcasting the interference frequencies. The Corvin security chief was thinking clearly again, and what he was thinking was making him very uncomfortable. "You're saying that humans are more adaptable because you're younger," Grothmar said slowly. "That inexperience is actually a strength. I'm saying that humans excel at thinking outside established paradigms because we haven't had time to become locked into them," Marcus replied. "You've all been playing by rules that were established thousands of years ago. I've been playing a completely different game. The truth was even more complex than that, but Marcus saw no reason to explain the full extent of human strategic thinking to his former tormentors. He didn't mention the centuries of human warfare that had refined their understanding of psychological manipulation, the game theory principles that had been developed during the corporate wars, or the extensive xenopsychology research that Earth had conducted in preparation for exactly this type of situation. Instead, he focused on the immediate consequences of their current predicament. "The Galactic Mining Council's investigation team will arrive in 6 days," Marcus announced, calling up another set of documents. "They're coming to evaluate the management structure and determine whether emergency intervention is necessary. Based on current productivity metrics and the evidence I've submitted, their recommendation is likely to be unfavorable for the current leadership." The 3 aliens exchanged glances that conveyed volumes of unspoken communication. They were all experienced enough to understand the implications of a council investigation. Careers would be destroyed, reputations would be ruined, and the consequences would follow them for the rest of their lives. However, Marcus continued, there is an alternative. If the current management voluntarily restructures the operation and demonstrates immediate improvement in productivity and cooperation, the council might be willing to consider the matter resolved. Silthera was the first to grasp the full implications of his offer. "You want us to place you in charge of the operation. I want you to place someone in charge who can actually make this operation successful," Marcus corrected. "Someone who understands that cooperation is more profitable than conflict. Someone who recognizes that diversity of approaches leads to better outcomes than enforced uniformity." He paused, allowing them to process his words before delivering the final element of his proposal. "The council has already indicated that they would approve such a restructuring, provided it results in immediate and sustained improvements. They're more interested in successful outcomes than in maintaining traditional hierarchies." It was a masterful piece of manipulation, offering them a way to save face while accepting a new reality that they would never have considered voluntarily. Marcus wasn't demanding their submission. He was offering them a partnership that happened to place him in the dominant position. Zextar's scales had settled into a dull gray pattern that Marcus recognized as resignation. "And if we refuse?" Marcus shrugged. "Then the council investigation proceeds as scheduled. Based on the evidence, I expect they'll remove all current leadership and install their own administrators. Given the documented pattern of harassment and sabotage, I doubt any of you would be offered positions in the new management structure." The aliens were trapped, and they all knew it. Marcus had constructed a scenario where their only viable option was to accept his leadership voluntarily or face much worse consequences imposed by external authority. But the most elegant aspect of his strategy was that his offer was actually genuine. Marcus wasn't interested in revenge or humiliation. He wanted to make the mining operation successful. Everything he had told them about cooperation and diversity was true. He had simply manipulated them into a position where they had no choice but to accept those principles. "What assurances do we have that you won't simply reverse our positions?" Grothmar asked. That you won't treat us the way we treated you? Marcus looked genuinely surprised by the question. Why would I do that? You're all competent professionals when you're not wasting energy on pointless conflicts. The Zephyrians are excellent geological surveyors. The Corvins run tight security operations. The Altarians have mastered quantum extraction techniques that are years ahead of human capabilities. He gestured to the productivity charts still floating above the conference table. The problem was never your individual competencies. The problem was a management structure that encouraged competition instead of cooperation. Fix the structure, and the individual talents can work together instead of against each other. It was a reasonable offer, perhaps more reasonable than any of them had expected. Marcus was proposing to use their strengths rather than exploit their weaknesses, to build on their capabilities rather than tear them down. Silthera closed her eyes. Performing what Marcus had learned was an Altarian meditation technique for processing complex decisions. When she opened them again, her expression was resigned but not defeated. If we agree to this restructuring, she said carefully, what exactly would our roles be in the new management structure? Marcus smiled, and this time there was no edge of predatory satisfaction in his expression. That depends on what roles you think would best serve the operation. I'm not interested in micromanaging specialists. I'm interested in creating a structure where everyone can perform at their peak capability. The hunt was effectively over. Marcus had achieved complete victory without destroying his opponents, turning predators into partners through a combination of strategic thinking and psychological manipulation that none of them had seen coming. The three alien species that had mocked the lone human were about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one that doesn't look like a threat until it's too late to escape. 6 months after the restructuring, the Kepler 442b mining operation had become the most successful interspecies collaboration in Galactic Mining Council history. Productivity had increased by 230%. Equipment failures had dropped to virtually zero, and the operation was extracting dark matter at rates that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Marcus stood in the same observation deck where he had watched the alien ships arrive nearly a year and a half earlier, but everything had changed. The station bustled with coordinated activity as teams of humans, Zephyrians, Corvins, and Altarians worked together with an efficiency that would have seemed impossible during those dark months of conflict and sabotage. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The first few weeks after the restructuring had been tense, with each species testing the boundaries of the new arrangement and learning to trust their former enemies. But Marcus had been patient, consistent, and most importantly, he had delivered on every promise he had made. Zexitar approached the observation deck. His scales displaying the vibrant blue-green patterns that Marcus had learned indicated contentment and professional satisfaction. The Zephyrians' geological surveys were now considered the gold standard for deep space mining operations, and his confidence had grown along with his reputation. The Eastern Sector surveys are complete, Zextar reported, his tone respectful but no longer subservient. We've identified 3 new deposit concentrations that should keep extraction teams busy for the next 8 months. The quantum composition analysis suggests purity levels above 92%. Marcus nodded appreciatively. Outstanding work. Have you coordinated with Silthera's team for the extraction timeline? Already done, Zextar replied with something that might have been pride. Her quantum extraction protocols have been modified to accommodate the unique crystalline structures we discovered. She estimates we can begin operations within 72 hours. The relationship between the Zephyrians and Altarians had evolved from mutual contempt to genuine professional respect. Zextar's geological expertise complemented Silthara's technical brilliance in ways that benefited both species, and they had learned to appreciate each other's contributions to their shared success. Grothmar's voice echoed through the station's communication system, calling all department heads to the main conference room for the weekly coordination meeting. The Corvin security chief had become the operations logistics coordinator, using his military precision and attention to detail to ensure that resources flowed smoothly between all teams and departments. The weekly meetings had evolved from tense confrontations into productive planning sessions where ideas flowed freely and decisions were made through consensus rather than conflict. Each species contributed their unique perspectives and capabilities, creating solutions that none of them could have developed independently. As Marcus made his way to the conference room, He reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The NISC system had been deactivated months ago, no longer needed for intelligence gathering or strategic manipulation. The aliens had proven that they could be trusted as genuine partners once the artificial barriers between them had been removed. The conference room was filled with animated discussion as representatives from all four species collaborated on plans for expanding the operation. The success of Kepler 442b had attracted attention from across the galaxy, and the Galactic Mining Council had requested that the team develop protocols for similar interspecies operations on other worlds. Silthera was explaining her latest innovations in quantum extraction technology, modifications that had been inspired by studying Corvin heavy equipment designs and Zephyrian geological analysis techniques. Her natural brilliance, no longer constrained by arrogance and prejudice, had flourished in the collaborative environment. The integration of multi-species approaches has yielded results that exceed the sum of individual capabilities, she reported, her tone carrying genuine excitement rather than condescending superiority. We're not just working together. We're creating entirely new methodologies that none of our species had conceived independently. Grothmar added his own observations about the operational efficiencies they had achieved. Resource allocation has improved by 300% since we began coordinating our efforts. Equipment maintenance schedules that used to conflict now complement each other. Security protocols that once hindered cooperation now enhance it by providing clear frameworks for interaction. Marcus listened to their reports with satisfaction, but not the cold satisfaction of a predator who had successfully hunted his prey. This was the warm satisfaction of a leader who had helped his team achieve something genuinely remarkable. The irony wasn't lost on him. The three alien species had initially seen humans as weak prey to be eliminated or dominated. Through months of careful manipulation, Marcus had turned the tables and placed himself in the dominant position. But the ultimate outcome wasn't domination at all. It was partnership. The hunt had ended not with the destruction of the prey, but with the transformation of predators into collaborators. There's something else we need to discuss, Marcus announced when the reports were finished. The Council has officially requested that we develop a training program for other interspecies operations. They want us to teach other teams how to achieve the kind of success we've demonstrated here. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They weren't just successful, they had become the model that the entire galaxy would try to emulate. Zextar was the first to speak, his scales displaying patterns of amazement. They want us to train other species in cooperation? They want us to train other species in leadership, Marcus corrected. Each of you has become an expert in your field while learning to integrate your capabilities with others. That's exactly what the galaxy needs more of. Silthera leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. A year ago, we were at each other's throats. Now they want us to teach cooperation to others. It's almost impossible to believe. A year ago, Grothmar rumbled. We thought strength meant dominating others. Now we know that real strength comes from helping others reach their potential. Marcus smiled, remembering his own thoughts from those early days when he had planned his campaign against the three alien species. He had set out to hunt predators who saw him as prey, and he had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. But the real victory wasn't that he had outmaneuvered his opponents or demonstrated human superiority. The real victory was that he had transformed enemies into allies, competition into collaboration, and hunting into partnership. The lone human who had been mocked and dismissed had indeed turned the tables, but not in the way that anyone had expected. He had turned a game of predator and prey into something entirely different. A story of species learning to see past their prejudices and work together toward goals that none of them could achieve alone. Outside the observation windows, the massive gas giant continued its eternal dance through space. But the mining station orbiting within its influence had become something new. It was no longer just an extraction operation. It had become a symbol of what was possible when different species chose cooperation over conflict. The hunt was over, but the real adventure was just beginning. The galaxy was about to learn what humans had always known, that the most dangerous predator isn't the one with the sharpest claws or the strongest weapons, but the one smart enough to turn enemies into friends and competition into collaboration. And sometimes, the greatest victory isn't defeating your opponents, but helping them become the best versions of themselves.